The Louisiana air was thick with heat, the kind that clung to your skin and made the night feel heavier than it should. Streetlights flickered unevenly, casting long shadows over cracked pavement as Naomi Carter stepped off the bus onto the streets of Baton Rouge for the first time in 7 years. She had thought she was ready for this, ready to return, ready to face whatever ghosts still lingered in the place she used to call home. But as she stood there, duffel bags slung over her shoulder, a strange unease settled in her chest. Something felt. A group of young men loitered outside a liquor store, their voices sharp, bouncing off the walls like static. Down the street, a couple argued in hushed tones, their faces partially hidden in the glow of a neon sign. The entire neighborhood was alive, yet something about it felt different, darker, heavier. If you've ever felt like the world around you has changed, like the place you once called home isn't the same anymore, let us know in the comments. Drop a 1 if this story pulls you in, a 0 if it doesn't, and if you're just here for the ride, hit that subscribe button for RVM Black Struggles. Naomi wasn't dressed like a soldier. A simple fitted t-shirt, cargo pants, and well-worn sneakers gave nothing away about who she really was. But no matter what she wore, she carried herself with the kind of presence that made people take notice. Shoulders squared, chin up, measured steps. Her father used to call it warrior posture. And after years in the military, after combat zones, after firefights, after losing friends in places most Americans couldn't pronounce, it wasn't something she could turn off. A boy, maybe 16, glanced up as she passed. He did a quick double take. "You military?" he asked, his voice more curious than cautious. Naomi paused, locking eyes with him. There was no fear in his gaze, just recognition. "Something like that," she replied. The boy grinned, figured, "My cousin's in the army, walks just like you." Before she could respond, his friend called him inside, and just like that he was gone. She exhaled slowly. Moments like this reminded her why she fought, why she endured. But this wasn't a war zone. At least it wasn't supposed to be. She had barely made it 2 blocks when she noticed the patrol car. It was subtle at first, just the low hum of an engine crawling along the curb, matching her pace. But she knew the drill. She had seen it 1,000 times in other places, in other lives. Before we go any further, if you're feeling the tension, if you're hooked on this story, do us a favor, hit that like button. Share this video and help spread these powerful stories. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to RVM Black Struggles for more content like this. A slow, calculated approach, a moment of hesitation before the inevitable. The window rolled down with an almost lazy arrogance. A gravelly voice cut through the humid night air. "Excuse me, miss." Naomi stopped, turned slightly, and met the gaze of Officer Brad Simmons. White, mid-40s, crew cut, thick arms, and that smirk, the kind that let her know he enjoyed moments like this a little too much. His mirrored sunglasses hid his eyes, but she didn't need to see them to know exactly what he was thinking. She had encountered men like him before, men who saw a confident black woman and mistook it for a challenge. "Mind telling me what you're doing around here?" His tone was casual, but Naomi heard what was underneath it. She shifted the strap of her duffel bag, letting a beat of silence pass between them. "Just walking," she said, her voice unreadable. "Where to?" She arched an eyebrow. "Didn't realize I needed an itinerary to walk down my own street." Simmons's smirk faded, just slightly. "We've had some break-ins around here," he said, tilting his head. "Gotta make sure everything's in order." Naomi held his gaze, unfazed, unshaken, unbothered. "You see me breaking into something?" Silence. A muscle in his jaw twitched. He leaned against the open window, exhaling sharply through his nose. "Just doing my job." Naomi could feel it, the shift in weight, the shift in power. Simmons wasn't looking for a conversation. He was looking for control. She had 2 choices, keep engaging, or walk away. But before she could decide, Simmons put the car in park. "Hold on a second. Let's see some ID." And just like that she knew, this wasn't over. The street was quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional chatter from a nearby store. But in this moment, none of that mattered. This moment belonged to them, a storm waiting to break. And Naomi Carter, she had never been one to run from the storm. The streetlights flickered, their weak glow barely illuminating the tension thickening in the air. Naomi didn't move. She had faced warlords, insurgents and mercenaries, men who held lives in their hands and played God on the battlefield. But this was different. This wasn't some war-torn country, thousands of miles away. This was her own neighborhood. And yet here she was being treated like a stranger. Simmons leaned forward slightly, resting his thick forearm on the edge of his open window. The leather of his holster creaked as he shifted, just enough for her to notice. Not a threat, not yet, but a warning. I said, "Let's see some ID." Naomi exhaled slowly, controlled, deliberate. She had been trained for moments like this, not just on the battlefield, but in life. The rules were simple: stay calm, don't escalate, but rules only worked if both sides played fair. She reached into her pocket, slow and steady, never breaking eye contact, pulled out her military ID and held it up, not handing it over, just letting him see. Simmons squinted, then scoffed. "Navy SEALs?" He dragged out the words like they were some kind of joke. "That's cute." Naomi didn't blink, didn't flinch. "Return it," she thought. "Give it back and walk away." But Simmons didn't move. Instead, he snatched the ID from her hand, turning it over between his fingers like he had just caught her in a lie. "You sure this ain't fake?" A flicker of heat pulsed through Naomi's chest. Not anger, annoyance. She had seen this before in military briefings, in boardrooms filled with men who thought her presence was a mistake. She had earned her rank, earned her title, earned her place, and yet here she was having to prove it. Again. "You can run it through your system," she said evenly. "You'll find out soon enough." Simmons studied her, his smirk returning as if he had already decided she was lying. "You expect me to believe you've been out there fighting for this country?" His voice dripped with condescension. "Please." That was the moment everything changed. Naomi saw the shift, the way the people around them stopped pretending they weren't watching. A young woman on the sidewalk raised her phone, recording. She wasn't hiding it. She wanted Simmons to see, and he did. Simmons' shoulders squared, his stance shifting. A man like him didn't like being watched. He flicked his gaze back to Naomi, his jaw clenching just slightly. "I don't appreciate people making a show out of me doing my job," he muttered. Naomi let out a breath, just a whisper of a smirk touching the corner of her lips, then stopped putting on a show. For the first time, Simmons hesitated, just a flicker of uncertainty, but it was there. And then he stepped out of the car. The moment his boots hit the pavement, the energy changed. People who had been passing by suddenly stopped moving. A man across the street folded his arms, watching. Simmons wasn't just a cop anymore. He was a man who refused to be embarrassed. And Naomi, she had just made his list. He took a step forward, standing just inches from her, deliberately crowding her space. "I don't know who you think you are," he said, voice low. "But out here, I make the calls." Naomi held her ground. "You sure about that?" For a second, neither of them moved. And then Simmons made his first mistake. He reached for her wrist. Bad move. Naomi's body reacted before her mind had to. A simple pivot, a shift of weight, and suddenly, Simmons's grip met nothing but air. His own momentum betrayed him. To the crowd, it must have looked like he was stumbling, like he had lost control. And that was worse than any punch. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. "Damn, she slipped right out of that," someone muttered. The young woman recording zoomed in, her face unreadable. Simmons's breath came quicker now, his chest rising and falling. His face flushed red, his ego shattered. Naomi stayed completely still, hands relaxed at her sides. "Officer Simmons," she said, voice calm, "you're losing control of the situation." His jaw clenched so tight she thought his teeth might crack. She had humiliated him without even touching him. And Simmons wasn't the kind of man to let that slide. He wasn't backing down. Not now, not with so many eyes on him. And Naomi, she could feel it. This was about to get worse, much worse. A stillness settled over the street, the kind that came before a storm. Naomi felt it in her bones. Simmons's face was red now, his jaw tight, his nostrils flaring as he squared his shoulders. He had lost control for a split second, but to a man like him, that was unforgivable. His hand hovered near his belt, fingers twitching, not at his gun but at his cuffs. Naomi had seen this before. A man at the edge, a man who had already made up his mind. She glanced past him. The woman with the phone, still recording. The people on the sidewalk, still watching. A bystander near a food truck whispered something to his friend. The tension wasn't just between Naomi and Simmons anymore. It belonged to everyone now. Simmons wasn't thinking about the law anymore. He was thinking about saving face, and that made him dangerous. You think this is funny? His voice was lower now, tight with barely contained rage. Naomi said nothing. That only made it worse. You know what? He continued, taking a slow step forward. I don't need to ask you again. Turn around, hands behind your back. Naomi inhaled slowly. She had 3 choices. Let him cuff her. Let him parade her in front of this crowd. Drag her to the station, twist the story however he wanted. Not an option. Run. Make him chase her. Make him escalate. Even worse. Stop this before it goes too far. She chose the third. She chose her words carefully. Officer Simmons, she said, calm but firm. You're making a mistake. His lips curled, mocking. No, he sneered. You made the mistake when you thought you could walk away from me. And then he lunged. Bad move. Naomi's body moved before her mind had to. His hand reached for her wrist, but she was faster. A simple shift of weight, a redirection. In an instant, Simmons's momentum worked against him. His balance broke, and suddenly he was the one stumbling. The entire street gasped. A few people took a step closer, watching, filming. Someone near the food truck whistled low. Damn, Naomi hadn't even touched him. But Simmons, to the crowd, to the recording cameras, it must have looked like he had just tripped over his own pride. Simmons caught himself just in time, his arms flailing for a split second before he found his footing. Then silence. The only sound was the quiet hum of a passing car, the occasional murmur from the people watching. Naomi stood still. No aggression, no movement, just pure unshakable control. Simmons's chest rose and fell, his breathing heavier now. He knew what had just happened, the worst thing possible. He had been embarrassed, and there were witnesses. A lot of them. Simmons's face burned red, his fingers curled into fists at his sides. Naomi's voice was measured, steady. Are we done here? He didn't answer. Couldn't. He was at a crossroads now. Either he walked away or he made the biggest mistake of his career. The decision hung in the air. Then a new voice cut through the street. What the hell is going on here? A second patrol car had just pulled up. A door slammed shut. A new officer stepped onto the street. Old, more experienced, more dangerous. Sergeant William Brooks. His sharp blue eyes flicked between them, taking in the scene in an instant. Simmons, shaking with rage. Naomi, calm and unshaken. The crowd, filming every second of it. Brooks exhaled sharply, adjusting his belt. He already knew. This wasn't just a routine stop. This was a problem, and someone was about to pay for it. Sergeant William Brooks stepped onto the pavement with calculated authority. He wasn't the kind of cop that asked questions he didn't already know the answers to. And right now, he knew this situation had already spiraled out of control. His eyes flicked to Officer Brad Simmons, who stood stiff as a board, face red, chest still heaving from whatever the hell just happened. Then to Naomi Carter, who stood perfectly still, controlled, unshaken. And finally, to the crowd, phones raised, murmurs rippling, an entire street now invested in whether or not this was about to go nuclear. Brooks sighed, rubbing his jaw before speaking. Officer Simmons, his voice was cool, unbothered, dangerous. Explain. Simmons' jaw clenched, his hand twitched at his side. His fingers still curled into a tight fist. He hesitated too long. Brooks narrowed his eyes. He saw it. The way Simmons was playing the scene back in his head, trying to twist it into something that didn't make him look like a fool. Finally, through gritted teeth, he spoke. She resisted. A scoff, sharp and unimpressed, came from the crowd. The young woman recording tilted her phone slightly. That's a lie, and we all saw it. Brooks didn't acknowledge her. He didn't have to, because he already knew she was right. He exhaled through his nose. Then slowly turned to Naomi. Is that what happened? Naomi's voice was measured, each word carefully chosen. No, he stopped me for no reason. Asked for my ID. I gave it to him. She let that settle before continuing. Then he accused me of lying about who I am. A beat of silence. When I refused to let him put cuffs on me for nothing, he reached for me. I stopped him. Brooks studied her, assessing, calculating. He wasn't stupid. He could see exactly what had happened. And now, he had a very big problem. He exhaled slowly, and then his eyes landed on something. The military ID, still clutched in Simmons' fist. Recognition, then realization, then regret. Lieutenant Carter, Simmons' entire body went still. The crowd rippled with murmurs. The air grew heavier. Simmons' face paled. His posture stiffened. Naomi didn't blink, didn't smirk, didn't gloat. She just waited. Brooks' voice was quieter now, sharper. "You're a Navy SEAL?" "Yes, sir." Another wave of murmurs spread through the crowd. Simmons twitched. Brooks turned back to him, his expression shifting. "You knew that?" Simmons' fingers tightened around the ID. Brooks didn't wait for an excuse. His gaze swept across the crowd, phones still recording. He turned to Naomi. "Anyone have footage of this interaction?" At least 10 hands shot up. The young woman with the phone. She smirked. "I got everything." Brooks inhaled, rubbing his temple. Then finally, he looked back at Simmons and gave the order. "Officer Simmons, you're relieved of duty." "Effective immediately." Gasps, whispers, a low, disbelieving ripple through the crowd. Naomi, she didn't react. Simmons, though, his hands curled into fists. His entire body radiated pure humiliation. "You can't be serious." Brooks' voice was calm, unshaken. "Final. I suggest you stop talking before you make this worse." Naomi held Simmons' gaze one last time. No words, just understanding. She had won, and he knew it. But what Simmons did next, that no one saw coming. For a split second, it felt like the street itself was holding its breath. Simmons stood frozen, his entire body trembling. Not from fear, but from pure, unfiltered rage. His face was still red, his ego shattered, and then he snapped. "You think this is over?" His voice boomed through the street, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. Brooks's head snapped toward him. "Simmons, stand down." But Simmons wasn't listening anymore. His eyes locked onto Naomi, and in that moment, she knew. He was going to do something stupid. Something reckless, something dangerous. His hands twitched toward his belt. Not at his gun, but at his radio. "Dispatch. I need backup." Naomi moved first. A sharp, precise shift of weight. Before Simmons could even finish speaking, Naomi struck. Not a punch, not an attack, just a redirection. She stepped into his space, twisted his wrist just enough, and suddenly Simmons was the one off balance. The radio clattered to the ground, gasps ripped through the crowd. She didn't even hit him. But Simmons wasn't done. He recovered too quickly, his breath ragged, his rage feral now. "You bitch." And that's when he did it. He lunged. At Naomi. At a Navy SEAL. At a woman who had spent her entire life learning how to end fights before they began. Bad move. Very bad move. Naomi moved like a ghost. Smooth, unstoppable. One step back, one pivot, one perfect redirection. Simmons' own momentum betrayed him, and in a single effortless motion, Naomi flipped him hard. The sound of his body hitting the pavement echoed like a gunshot. The entire block erupted. "No way." She just dropped his ass. Phones zoomed in. Every second recorded. Simmons hit the ground hard, his breath knocked from his lungs, his hands slapping the pavement in a pathetic attempt to catch himself. His uniform covered in dirt, his authority destroyed. Naomi didn't move, she just looked down at him. And in a voice calm, steady, unshaken, she spoke. "Are we done now?" Simmons couldn't even respond. He was too busy gasping for air. Too busy realizing he had just lost everything. And then the final blow. Brooks stepped forward. His voice was low, dangerous. "Final. Brad Simmons, you're under arrest." The street erupted again. People cheered, clapped. The woman with the phone, she grinned. "Oh, this is going viral." Simmons tried to speak, to argue, to salvage what little dignity he had left. But he had nothing. Nothing but a badge that didn't mean a damn thing anymore. And as Brooks pulled out the cuffs, Simmons finally understood. His career was over, but for Naomi, this wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. Because the moment Brooks reached for his radio, his face changed. Not anger, not frustration, but fear. And then his voice, tight, clipped, tense. "Carter, get off the street, now." Naomi's eyes narrowed. "What?" Brooks's jaw tightened. Then a sound in the distance. Sirens. But not police sirens. Something else. Something worse. And Naomi? She realized this fight had only just begun. The moment Naomi heard the sirens, she knew something was wrong. This wasn't normal. She had spent years in war zones, in the kind of places where the sound of approaching vehicles didn't mean help was coming. It meant the real fight was about to begin. And this felt just like that. Brooks's face had gone pale, his eyes darting toward the main road. Simmons was just the beginning, Naomi thought. Something bigger was in motion, and she wasn't sure if Brooks was trying to protect her, or if he knew exactly what was coming next. The sirens grew louder. Then the headlights, not police cruisers, but 3 large black SUVs, unmarked, no police decals, no badges, just power. And Naomi, she had seen vehicles like that before, overseas, in hostile territory. Vehicles that didn't belong to law enforcement, vehicles that belonged to people who didn't have to follow rules. The first SUV skidded to a stop, then another, then the last one. The doors swung open and 6 men stepped out. Not cops, no uniforms, no badges, just presence. Men built like enforcers, like muscle. And the one in the center, he wasn't here for a conversation. Naomi's hands instinctively curled into fists, because she recognized him, from a life she thought she left behind. His name was Marcus Shaw, a high-level security contractor, a fixer, the kind of man who got called in when the law wasn't enough to handle a problem. And right now, that problem was her. Brooks took a half step forward, his body tense. "This is a bad idea, Shaw," Brooks muttered under his breath. Marcus Shaw smirked. "Not my call, Sarge." His voice was smooth, effortless. The kind of fauves that made deals, not arrests. He turned his eyes to Naomi, scanning her the way a hunter sizes up a target. "Lieutenant Carter," he said, "you've caused quite a mess tonight." The way he said it, it wasn't an accusation, it was admiration. And that made Naomi's skin crawl more than anything else. Because men like Shaw, they didn't fear consequences. They didn't fear getting caught. They only feared losing control. And right now, he was here to take it back. Naomi didn't blink. "Not my mess," she said. "You can thank your boy Simmons for that." A slow chuckle rumbled from Shaw's chest. "Oh, Simmons was never my boy." He glanced at the officer still handcuffed on the pavement, pathetic and broken. "But he was useful." A pause. "And now, he's not." Simmons' eyes wide. He knew what that meant. Naomi did too. Simmons was already dead. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but soon, because if Shaw's people didn't see value in him anymore, they'd make sure he disappeared before he could talk. Naomi could feel the noose tightening around the entire street. And then, Shaw took a single step forward. "You're a fighter, Carter. I respect that." Naomi didn't move, didn't give him the satisfaction of reacting. "Walk away," he said. "That's the smart move here." Brooks's jaw tightened. He wanted to say something, wanted to warn her, but he couldn't, because he knew how this worked, how people like Shaw operated. There was no way out of this without blood being spilled. Naomi exhaled through her nose, calm, controlled, a soldier through and through. But inside, she was calculating. She needed to get ahead of this. Because this wasn't about one bad cop anymore. This was bigger. And if she wasn't careful, she wasn't going to survive the night. Naomi Carter had been in dangerous situations before. Firefights in Mogadishu, ambushes in Kandahar, operations that never made the news. But this was something different. This wasn't just about her. This was calculated, planned, personal. Marcus Shaw stood dead center in the street, his hands in his pockets, looking more like a businessman closing a deal than a hired gun sent to handle a problem. But Naomi knew exactly who he was, what he was. A keener, a man who made people disappear. And tonight, she was on his list. The street around them had gone silent, except for the distant hum of those black SUVs, still idling. The crowd, they had gone from spectators to hostages of the moment. They knew something was wrong, knew that this wasn't just about a dirty cop anymore, knew that Naomi was in real danger. Brooks was tense beside her. He hadn't drawn his weapon because he knew it wouldn't make a difference. Marcus Shaw and his men, they didn't operate under the same rules. This wasn't a police matter anymore. This was something bigger. And Naomi, She was running out of option. Shaw tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Here's how this works, Lieutenant," he said. His voice was smooth, effortless. "You walk away, you forget about tonight, and we don't have a problem." A pause. His eyes darkened. "You don't?" And suddenly a lot of people you care about start having bad days. Naomi's muscles coiled. Not from fear, from anger. Because she knew that threat wasn't empty. She had seen men like Shaw before. Men who didn't just erase problems. They erased people. And if she walked away now, if she let them bury this, then Simmons would just be replaced. Another cop, another corrupt system, and nothing would change. Naomi exhaled slowly, her body steady. And then she smiled. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't forced. It was the kind of smile that told a man like Shaw that he had just made a mistake. "You're afraid," she said. That smile did something. Shaw's face twitched just slightly. But Naomi saw it, and she pushed. "You wouldn't be here if this was just about Simmons. You wouldn't have sent your people. You wouldn't be standing here pretending like you have control." She took a slow step forward. "This isn't about me," her voice lowered. "This is about what I know." The second she said it, she saw it in his eyes. The flicker of doubt, the hesitation. And that's when Naomi realized something huge. This wasn't just about shutting her up. This was about protecting something else. Something bigger. Something that even Marcus Shaw didn't want getting out. And suddenly, Naomi wasn't just the hunted. She was the biggest threat in the room. Marcus Shaw exhaled, shaking his head slightly. Amused but irritated. "I tried to be nice about this," he muttered. Then his hand moved. And the second it did, Naomi knew what was coming. One of his men reached for something under his jacket. A gun. And then chaos. Brooks moved first. "Weapon. Drop it." But before he could even reach for his own firearm, the first gunshot rang out. And Naomi? She was already moving. Instinct. Training. Years of experience. She pivoted just as the first shot cracked through the air. And Brooks went down. Hit. Naomi's stomach twisted. "Brooks." More shots. Screams erupted from the crowd. Phones dropped. People ran. Naomi didn't have a weapon. Didn't have backup. Didn't have time. But she had something better. Her body became a weapon. She closed the distance between her and Shaw's nearest gunman in seconds. One precise movement, and she drove an elbow into his throat. His gun clattered to the pavement. Naomi grabbed it before it hit the ground, turned, fired. 2 shots center mass. One of Shaw's men went down. The other, they scattered. Shaw, he was already moving, ducking back into the SUV, barking orders. And then tires screeched. The SUVs peeled out. Shaw was gone. Naomi stood in the middle of the street, gun still raised. The night was shattered. Simmons was still on the ground, shaking. The civilians who hadn't fled were staring, recording, but none of that mattered. Brooks was still down. Naomi dropped to her knees, pressing a hand against his wound. "Stay with me, Brooks." His breathing was shaky, but he was still alive. And Naomi, she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the truth, for whatever the hell Shaw was trying to bury. And she had a feeling this wasn't the last time she'd see him. Not by a long shot. The street was a war zone. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air, mixing with the distant scent of fried food from the restaurant on the corner. Sirens, real police sirens, this time, finally screamed toward the scene. But it was too late. Marcus Shaw was gone. His men scattered. And Naomi Carter? She was still standing. But Brooks? He was bleeding out beneath her hands. "Stay with me," she muttered, pressing harder against the wound on his side. He coughed, a weak, ragged sound. "First time I've been shot in 20 years, he rasped, half smirking through the pain. "Could have gone another 20. Naomi snorted. But there was no humor in it. His blood was soaking through her hands. She needed to keep him conscious. "You're lucky," she said. "They could have aimed higher." Brooks wheezed out a breath. "Lucky," he repeated. "Yeah, that's me." The flashing red and blue lights spilled over the block as multiple squad cars finally arrived, screeching to a stop. Doors slammed open. Officers rushed out, weapons drawn. But Naomi, she was done playing games. She slowly raised her hands. one still covered in Brooks's blood. "I didn't shoot first," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Check the cameras." The young woman with the phone, who had never stopped recording, stepped forward. "She's telling the truth," she said, flipping her screen toward the officers. "I got the whole thing." A moment of tension, then recognition. One of the responding officers, a lieutenant, saw Brooks on the ground, and his entire demeanor changed. "Get a medic over here." Paramedics stormed in, pushing Naomi aside. Brooks was lifted onto a stretcher, his fingers briefly grasping Naomi's wrist before they took him. "Finish this," he murmured. Then he was gone. The aftermath. Naomi didn't leave the precinct until morning. Not because they arrested her, they knew better than that now, but because she made sure Simmons didn't walk away from this clean. The moment they pulled his body off the pavement, he started talking, and what he said confirmed every suspicion Naomi had. Simmons was dirty, but he wasn't the mastermind. He was just another pawn. Shaw had his hands in something bigger, something deep inside the law enforcement system, and Simmons was just one of many. And now, Shaw knew Naomi wasn't just another problem. She was a threat, and people like Shaw, they didn't let threats walk away. 1 week later, Naomi sat on the steps of her father's old house, the wood creaking beneath her. A beer, half empty, rested on the step beside her. The TV inside played the news. Breaking: Baton Rouge police officer Brad Simmons faces federal investigation for corruption charges. Sources claim his connection to a larger criminal organization is under review. Naomi exhaled slowly. She had done something, but not enough, because Marcus Shaw was still out there, still pulling strings, and if she knew anything about men like him, he wasn't done with her. A shadow moved in her periphery. She didn't tense, didn't reach for a weapon. She just said, "I heard you coming." Uncle Ray stepped onto the porch, chuckling. "Guess that Navy SEAL training didn't go to waste," he said, cracking open his own beer. Naomi took a slow sip. "You see the new..." Ray snorted. "Yeah, but that ain't the real story." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Then what is?" Ray took a sip of his drink. Then he looked her dead in the eye. "How long before they come after you?" Silence, because Naomi knew the answer. Not long. Not long at all. She looked down at her beer, swirling it once before setting it aside. "Then I guess I better be ready." Ray studied her for a long moment. Then he grinned. "That's my girl." The screen door behind them creaked in the wind. And Naomi Carter? She just sat there, waiting, watching, because she knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Real-life lessons from Naomi Carter's story. Naomi Carter's story isn't just a thrilling confrontation. It's a reflection of real life. Every day, people face injustice, corruption, and abuse of power. It may not always come in the form of a rogue cop or a secret criminal network, but systemic issues exist everywhere, in the workplace, in institutions, even in personal relationships. So what can we learn? Stand your ground. Like Naomi, we must recognize when we're being manipulated or pressured into submission. Confidence and composure are powerful tools. Corruption thrives on silence. Simmons was just one bad cop, but he was part of something big. Change doesn't happen by ignoring the problem. It happens when people expose the truth, no matter the risk. Power only works when people let it. Shaw tried to intimidate Naomi, but she flipped the script. Bullies, whether in life or in leadership, lose power when they realize they can't control you. Be prepared. The fight for truth and justice doesn't end with one victory. There will always be another battle. Stay vigilant, stay strong. In a world that often rewards corruption, choosing integrity is an act of rebellion. Be the one who refuses to back down.